a Jesus, or the Jesus. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 4. For if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it easily enough. The Corinthian church believed that Jesus was the Christ, and when others came to the church to preach the other Jesus, they accepted it. Then what is another Jesus? The other Jesus seems to have conveyed about Jesus based on Jesus' actions. So they did not focus on Jesus as the Christ and went different direction. In this regard, Galatians says it is a different gospel. Galatians chapter 1 verse 6. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Then what is another gospel, another Jesus? It does not focus on Jesus being Christ, but only recognizing the personality of Jesus, or pursuing only the mysterious miracles of Jesus. Of course, Jesus' actions are well represented in the four Gospels. However, Jesus did all these miracles and told all the words to show that he was Christ, but those who followed them did not know it. A similar example is Apollos, who preached a lot about Jesus. Priscilla and Aquila met this Apollos and delivered the gospel more accurately to him. In other words, they explained that Jesus was the Christ. As a result, Apollos' preaching changed to tell that Jesus was the Christ. Acts chapter 18 verse 24. Meanwhile a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man, with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. 25. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. 26. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. 27. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed. 28. For he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Then why do we need the Christ? As I had explained in the previous sermon, we are made by the image of God, Christ. Without Christ we cannot live. But our ancestor Adam took it lightly and broke God's promise. As a result, he suffered curses and lived a life caught in Satan. Eventually, it was destined to go to hell. God knew it and promised to send Christ to us. Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Christ means the anointed. In the Old Testament, the king, the prophet, and the priest were anointed. That Jesus is the Christ means that Jesus is the true king, true prophet, and true priest. In other words, Jesus is the true king who broke the head of Satan, a true priest who died on the cross in place of our sins, a true prophet who was the way to meet God. In fact, the Old Testament writes that this Christ is coming. It is the content of the Old Testament that Israel waited the offspring of a woman, the promise from God. The descendants of Adam in the Old Testament waited Christ for their entire lives. They also knew that God came to reveal how Christ came. The Old Testament predicts how Christ will come in more than 300 predictions. A typical example is that he came from Bethlehem, came as a descendant of the woman, died on the cross, and resurrected in 3 days. Christ is the hope of Israel and our hope. Satan, however, keeps tricking us so we do not know that the Bible explains Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Even the Corinthian church, which received the message of the apostles in the early church, heard the words of the false apostles who have came into the church and focused on the other Jesus, not focusing on Jesus being the Christ. So the apostle Paul sighed in today's text. So the Christians who were waiting for Christ were looking for something other than Christ, deceived by false apostles. This is still the case today. The Bible tells us that Jesus is the Christ. The Old Testament is about coming Christ. The New Testament is that the Christ came and the Christ is Jesus. Christ is also our life. Also, the world is dying because they do not know this Christ. If we first know, understand, and believe in Jesus as Christ through the Bible, we will have a mind to save this world dying without Christ. Do we find the Jesus every day? Or are you missing the life of a true Christian through a Jesus?